6 years ago, she walked away from him. Now, he is about to uncover the secret she left behind. Lena Whitmore had spent most of her life believing that Alexander Hayes was the embodiment of perfection. From their teenage years to the hallways of Westfield Medical School, he had always been someone she admired from afar. Untouchable, brilliant, and utterly out of reach. He was the kind of man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, yet never seemed burdened by it. The one everyone looked up to. The one people whispered about in admiration. To her, Alexander was more than just a man. He was a dream, an impossible wish she had dared to hope for. And in the cruelest twist of fate, that wish had come true, but not in the way she had imagined. Their marriage had not been built on love, nor on mutual desire. It was the result of duty, of expectation, of a carefully constructed plan orchestrated by others who cared more about power and legacy than about the lives they were binding together. Alexander had never wanted her, and he had made that clear from the very beginning. His grandfather, the formidable patriarch of the Hayes family, had been on his deathbed, convinced that a stable marriage would solidify their family's fortune and ensure the longevity of their legacy. In his eyes, Alexander's future hinged not on love, but on responsibility, on the unbreakable bonds of blood and tradition. The Whitmore family, with their wealth and influence in the medical industry, had been the perfect match. A merger disguised as matrimony, a business transaction sealed with vows. Alexander's father had agreed to it without hesitation, seeing only the advantages such a union would bring. Lena's stepmother, a woman whose love was as conditional as it was distant, had pushed her toward the altar with little regard for her feelings. No one had asked Lena what she wanted. No one had given her a choice. But she had gone along with it, foolishly believing that perhaps, over time, Alexander would see her, that he would learn to love her, that if she stayed, if she was patient, if she proved herself, she would become more than just a name on a marriage certificate. She had never been more wrong. She remembered the exact moment her dream had shattered. The moment when she had realized that she had built her hopes on nothing but illusions. Their wedding night had been meant to mark the beginning of their new life together. She had spent years imagining what it would be like to be his wife, to stand by his side, to share his world. But when he walked into their suite that night, the air between them was cold, suffocating. His expression was unreadable, his movements precise, calculated. He had barely looked at her when he spoke, his voice devoid of warmth. "I need you to understand something," he had said, his tone so detached it sent a chill down her spine. "This marriage is nothing more than an obligation to me. I was forced into this, but my heart, my life, belongs to someone else." Lena had felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as if everything she had ever known had come undone. "Her name is Celeste," he continued, unrelenting. "She is everything you are not. She is the woman I should have married, the only woman I love." The words had cut through her, sharp and unforgiving. "You were never meant to be my wife, Lena. You were just convenient." She had swallowed the pain, forced herself to remain standing, even as her world crumbled. "Then why did you marry me?" she had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander had shrugged, indifferent. "Because I had no choice." And with that, he had walked out, leaving her alone on what should have been the most important night of her life. From that night on, Lena had lived in a house that felt more like a prison, bound to a man who wanted nothing to do with her. Alexander never looked at her, never touched her, never acknowledged her beyond what was necessary to keep up appearances. To him, she was a burden, an inconvenience, an unwanted shadow in his perfect life. He spent his nights elsewhere, at parties, at exclusive gatherings, in the arms of Celeste. Lena had once loved him, but as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, she began to wonder if the girl who had once dreamed of him had ever truly existed at all. For 3 years, Lena tried. She waited for him. She prepared dinner, even though she knew he wouldn't eat at home. If he stumbled in late, reeking of alcohol, she helped him into bed and made sure he was comfortable. When he was sick, she was the only one who cared. On cold winter nights, she turned on the heater before he woke up so he wouldn't feel the chill. She gave him everything, and it had never mattered. Alexander never loved her. He never would. The realization struck her with finality on the night of her birthday. She had long since stopped expecting anything from him, but still some foolish part of her had hoped, just a little, that he might acknowledge it. That maybe for once he would look at her and see her. But he wasn't there. He had spent the day at the hospital, with Celeste. That was when Lena understood, really understood, that she had never meant anything to him. And she never would. That night, she made her decision. She dressed carefully, draping a silk robe over her shoulders, and walked to his office. He was seated at his desk, lost in work, the glow of his desk lamp casting sharp shadows over his face. He didn't even glance up until he heard her footsteps. Alexander frowned, surprised to see her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice edged with impatience. Lena moved closer, slow but steady. There was something different in her eyes, something he had never seen before. Determination. "For 3 years," she said quietly, "I've tried to be the wife you wanted, even though I knew you never wanted me." Alexander's brows drew together, but he said nothing. "But I'm done," she continued. "I won't live in this illusion any longer." She let out a soft breath. "Tomorrow I'll be free to start over. Let's get a divorce." His frown deepened. Before he could speak, Lena did something reckless, something she knew she would regret. She leaned in and kissed him. At first, it was hesitant, a stolen moment. But then years of suppressed longing, heartbreak, and desperation poured into the kiss. Alexander stiffened in shock, instinct telling him to push her away. But he didn't. Something in him froze. Her touch sent a shiver down his spine, were anger and desire colliding in a war he didn't understand. How dare she? And yet, why did his body burn as if it had been waiting for this moment all along? Lena trembled, her hands moving over him as if memorizing him, as if trying to steal something from him before she walked away for good. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered against his lips, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Her words shattered whatever restraint he had left. His grip tightened around her arms, his breath ragged. For the first time in 3 years, Alexander really looked at her. And there, in the quiet darkness, with nothing but the hum of their own heartbeats between them, something finally broke. An hour later, Lena slowly pulled away, her heart still hammering. Alexander watched her, his expression unreadable. But this wasn't a beginning, it was an ending, and Lena had made her choice. She woke before dawn, dressing silently. Every movement felt heavier than it should have, but she forced herself forward. Reaching into the drawer, she retrieved the divorce papers. She placed them neatly on the bedside table. Then, standing at the edge of the bed, she looked at him one last time. He was still asleep. His face, usually cold and guarded, was uncharacteristically peaceful. Lena inhaled sharply. "I'm letting you go," she murmured. "From now on we walk separate paths. No more ties, no more illusions." The words were for herself more than for him. She turned away, and for the first time in years she left without looking back. Alexander woke to silence. He stretched lazily, running a hand over the empty space beside him. That wasn't unusual. Lena often woke before him. But today, something felt different. And then he saw them. The papers, sitting on the bedside table like a final goodbye. A strange weight settled in his chest. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Hayes felt the cold sting of something he couldn't name. Alexander's fingers tightened around the papers, his grip crumpling the edges as his mind struggled to process what he was looking at. Divorce certificate. The words blurred in his vision, each letter sinking into his brain like a slow-burning poison. At first he could only stare, reading the title over and over again, as if expecting the meaning to change. Then the anger came, hot and sharp, rising in his chest like wildfire. She had walked away. After everything. After 3 years of enduring this marriage. After everything she had put him through. After. His jaw clenched. First, she had forced herself into his bed. And now? Now she thought she could just walk away? A cold, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "What tricks does this woman still have in store?" he muttered, his voice edged with something dangerous. Throwing the papers aside, he got out of bed, his movements tense, rigid. He dressed quickly, his every motion fueled by the anger simmering beneath his skin. His footsteps were heavy as he stormed downstairs, his sharp gaze scanning the house, searching for any trace of her presence. He found none. His butler, Charles, was in the hallway, standing with the same poised demeanor he always carried. Alexander barely spared him a glance before demanding, "Where's Lena?" Charles hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Mrs. Hayes left the house at dawn, sir. She was carrying suitcases." Alexander froze. His entire body went rigid, his muscles locking as the words settled over him like ice. She was gone. For the first time in years, something that wasn't anger coursed through him. Something unsettling, something wrong. Lena had never tried to leave before, not once. She had endured every cold night, every moment of silence, every dismissal, and yet she had stayed. Until now. For the first time, Alexander felt something slip out of his control, and he hated it. The soft rhythm of rain tapped against the window of a small apartment in Brooklyn. Lena ran a tired hand through her loose hair, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. The nearly 24-hour shift at the New York Institute for Medical Research had drained her completely, but nothing compared to the relief of finally stepping through her front door. The moment she did, hurried footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, small and fast, followed by an excited voice. "Mommy, you took too long." A little body collided into her legs, small arms wrapping tightly around her waist. Lena barely had time to react before her son Brian clung to her, his little hands squeezing her as if she might disappear again. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a moment as she held him. Every single time she came home, he did this. No matter how exhausted she was, Brian's hug was enough to warm her heart and melt away every ounce of fatigue. Behind him, Marie, his nanny, appeared in the doorway, a small notebook in hand, worry flickering across her face. "He's been waiting for you all day, Lena," Marie said gently. "He was sad. He said he missed you." Lena's chest tightened. She knelt in front of Brian, brushing a soft kiss against his forehead, her fingers running through his dark curls. "I'm sorry, my love," she murmured. It was a difficult day at the hospital. His big brown eyes, her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Can we do an experiment before bed?" Lena let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Of course, her little scientist. Brian had an endless fascination with experiments, always eager to mix ingredients, measure solutions, and pretend he was conducting something important. "Just one," she said, holding up a finger, "and then it's bedtime." Brian grinned, clapping his hands excitedly before running off to grab his science kit. Lena exchanged a weary glance with Marie, who only offered a knowing smile. They both knew it. Lena needed to spend more time with Brian. But life had never made things easy for her. Not since she left London behind nearly 6 years ago. She had fought to rebuild her life from nothing. She had arrived in New York with no plan, no expectations, and no desire other than to lose herself in her work. She hadn't wanted to think about anything else, especially not about him. But then, everything had changed. Because she had discovered something that had shaken her world all over again. She was pregnant. The shock had been absolute, and yet it was nothing compared to the fear that followed. Lena had thought she had left it all behind. The pain, the past, him. But life had a way of pulling her back to the places she wanted most to forget. She still remembered the moment she had discovered she was pregnant. Fear had gripped her like a vice, twisting in her chest until she could barely breathe. She wasn't ready to be a mother. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready. For a long time, she had convinced herself that she wasn't meant for something as fragile as love, let alone raising a child. But deep down, beyond the fear, there had been something stronger, an unshakable certainty. She would have this child. No, she would have these children. Twins. For nearly 9 months, she prepared. She returned to London to give birth, believing that familiarity, the hospital she knew, the doctors she trusted, would bring her some kind of comfort, some kind of safety. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened that night. Even now, almost 6 years later, the memory haunted her. The cold sterility of the operating room, the urgency in the doctor's voices, the deafening silence that followed. One of them hadn't survived. Her daughter. Her baby girl had been deprived of oxygen during birth. She hadn't even had a chance to open her eyes to the world. Lena had left the hospital with only one child in her arms, Brian. Strong and healthy, but incomplete. A part of her had died along with her daughter, and since then, every day had been a battle to move forward. She never spoke about it. Not to Brian. Not to anyone. The hospital had kept her daughter for further research and studies, but Lena had left London the next day. She hadn't been able to stay in that city, not with the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had fled to New York, where no one knew her, where she could start over. She built a new life. She raised Brian with all the love she could give. She worked tirelessly to ensure that he would never lack for anything. And for almost 6 years, she had convinced herself that she had moved on, that she had escaped. But all of that changed tonight. Brian had finally fallen asleep after their evening experiment, his favorite, the classic vinegar and baking soda volcano. Lena smiled to herself, tucking him into bed before heading to the kitchen to make herself some tea. Just as she reached for the kettle, her phone vibrated on the countertop. A message. She glanced at the screen. Dr. Richard Lawson, St. James Hospital, London. Her heart stopped. London. It had been years since she had seen that name, since she had received any message from the UK. A strange tension coiled inside her as she unlocked her phone, her fingers tightening around it. Slowly, she opened the message. Scarlett, I hope you're well. We've been following your work and are impressed by your latest research. A position has opened up in our new cardiovascular research project, and we would like you to lead the team. We need you in London as soon as possible. Lena blinked, trying to absorb the words. London. Back to London. Her stomach twisted. On one hand, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. St. James Hospital was one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the world. A project like this could elevate her career to heights she had never imagined. But London was also the city where everything had fallen apart. It was the city where she had been forced into a loveless marriage. The city where she had lost her daughter. The city where she had been discarded and forgotten. Where Alexander Hayes still lived. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as old wounds threatened to resurface. She hadn't been back since the day she left, hadn't seen her father, hadn't seen her stepmother, had kept in touch with only one person, Emma, her best friend, the only one who had ever truly cared. She barely noticed when Marie walked into the kitchen, stopping short at the sight of her pale face. Lena, the nanny asked, frowning in concern. Is everything all right? Lena hesitated, her mind still spinning. Then she let out a slow breath. I just got an offer, she murmured, her voice strangely detached. An offer? Marie's eyebrows rose. For what? To go back to London. Marie stared at her for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. Are you going to accept? Lena bit her lip. She wanted to say no. She wanted to shut the door on the past and never look back. But deep down, she already knew the answer. St. James Hospital. A position like this. It wouldn't come again, and Brian deserved the best future she could give him. She closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly before whispering, I'm going. The words came out faster than she had expected, but once they were spoken, there was no taking them back. She had been running for 6 years. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to face the past. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to face him. Lena stood in the bustling terminal, gripping Brian's small hand as they waited for their boarding call. She had told Emma about the move last night. Her best friend had nearly freaked out. You're going back to London? Just like that? What choice do I have? Lena had sighed. This is my career, Em, and it's what's best for Brian. And what about Alexander? Lena had fallen silent. What about him? She had no plans to see him, no reason to cross paths with him. Their worlds had separated long ago. And she intended to keep it that way. Mommy? Brian's voice pulled her back to the present. She looked down at him, his big brown eyes blinking up at her, filled with innocent curiosity. Is London far? He asked. She forced a smile, squeezing his hand gently. Yes, baby, she said softly. But I promise, it'll be an adventure. And with that, they stepped forward, ready to board the plane. Lena had no idea what awaited her on the other side of the ocean. But she knew one thing for certain. London would never let her leave without a fight. Are you sure about this? No. But I have no choice. The moment the plane touched down at Heathrow, a chill ran down Lena's spine. She didn't know what awaited her here. But she was certain of one thing. Her return would not go unnoticed. The aircraft glided smoothly across the runway, yet inside, her thoughts were anything but steady. She glanced at Brian, still fast asleep beside her, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. He was blissfully unaware of the storm raging within her, of the memories clawing at the edges of her mind. Taking a slow breath, she shut her eyes, pressing back the wave of emotions. London, the place that had once been her home. Now it was nothing more than a bitter chapter in her past, one she never thought she would reopen. But fate, as always, had other plans. Beside her, Brian stirred, stretching his small arms before blinking up at her with sleepy curiosity. "Mom, are we there yet?" Lena forced a smile, smoothing his dark curls. "Yes, my love. We're in London." Brian yawned, rubbing his eyes before peering out the airplane window. His gaze widened, his excitement flickering to life. "Is this where you lived before me?" A lump formed in Lena's throat, but she nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "This is where I was born." Brian frowned in thought, as if processing that information, before flashing her a bright, innocent smile. "So now we're going to live in your old house?" Her heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "No, sweetheart, we're going to a new home." She would never go back to that house, not after everything. They moved through the airport, Lena gripping Brian's small hand tightly in hers, her suitcase rolling behind her. The closer they got to the exit, the faster her heart raced. Then she saw her, a familiar figure standing just beyond the arrival's gate, waiting with an eager, impatient expression. Emma. The moment their eyes met, Emma lit up. Without hesitation, she ran toward Lena, pulling her into a fierce hug. "My God, you're really here." Emma's voice was hushed with disbelief as she held Lena's shoulders, searching her face as if making sure she was real. "I can't believe I'm actually seeing you again after all this time." A wave of relief washed over Lena at having someone who knew her, someone who cared. "Gear with her." "I missed you too," she admitted. A small tug at her blouse made her look down. "Mom? Who's that?" Brian asked, his wide brown eyes filled with curiosity. Emma immediately crouched to his level, offering a warm smile. "I'm Emma, a very special friend of your mom's." Then she grinned. "And you must be the famous Brian." Brian's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "I'm famous?" Emma winked. "Your mom talks about you all the time." Lena stood back, watching the interaction, her heart softening. She had always known Emma would get along with Brian. Emma straightened, adjusting her coat. "Shall we go home?" she asked, grabbing one of Lena's suitcases before she could refuse. Lena nodded. And with that, they left Heathrow, stepping back into the city that had once swallowed her whole. London was both unchanged and entirely different. As the car wove through the streets, Lena watched the city pass by through the window. The towering buildings, the historic streets, the familiar corners where she had once walked as a different woman. 6 years ago, she had left this place with nothing but a broken heart and a newborn in her arms. Now she was back. But this time she wasn't the same woman. And yet, London still held ghosts. And sooner or later, she would have to face them. Later that night, after Brian had settled into his new room and fallen asleep, Lena curled up on the living room sofa, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. Emma sat across from her, watching her intently, eyes full of curiosity and concern. "How are you really feeling?" Emma finally asked. Lena let out a slow sigh, staring down at the swirling steam of her tea. "Tired," she admitted, scared. Then she lifted her gaze, but at the same time, determined. Emma nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then, after a pause, she asked the one question Lena had been dreading. "And what about him?" The air between them shifted, a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Lena didn't have to ask who him was. Even now, after all these years, Alexander Hayes's name still echoed in the shadows of her mind. She tightened her grip on her cup. "It doesn't matter." Her voice was firmer than she expected. "He belongs in the past, and that's where he'll stay." Emma arched an eyebrow. "Do you really think you'll be able to avoid him forever?" she asked, skeptical. "London might be big, but your social circle has always been small." Lena swallowed hard. She didn't want to think about that. She didn't want to think about him at all. But deep down, she knew the truth. The past had a way of catching up to you. And Alexander Hayes? He wasn't the kind of man you could outrun forever. "I'm not thinking about that right now." Lena's voice was firm, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Emma or herself. "My priority is Brian, and my work at the hospital." Emma sighed, but didn't push further. She knew when to let things go. "That's fine," she said gently. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, for anything." Lena gave her a small, grateful smile. She was lucky to have Emma by her side. But deep down, a restlessness was growing inside her, because no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she knew one undeniable truth. The past never stayed buried for long, and sooner or later, Alexander Hayes would find out she was back. What would happen then? She wasn't ready to find out. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the room. Lena stretched, blinking away sleep, before turning her head to find Brian still curled up beside her. His dark curls were a mess, his tiny fingers gripping the well-loved teddy bear he had carried since infancy. A warmth spread through her chest at the sight. This was what mattered. Not the city outside, not the ghosts lurking in its shadows, just him. And yet, even as she traced a gentle hand through his hair, the unease in her chest refused to fade. Emma, ever efficient and terrifyingly prepared, had already arranged everything. She had found a nanny, enrolled Brian in a renowned private school, sorted out all the logistics so that Lena could focus on her new job, all without Lena having to lift a finger. "How do you do these things so fast?" she had asked yesterday. Half in awe, half exasperated, Emma had just smirked. "I know you, Lena. I know exactly what you need before you even ask for it." Her first day at St. James Hospital passed in a whirlwind. Meetings, protocols, endless discussions about the research project she would be leading. The cardiovascular study was ambitious, groundbreaking, an opportunity to leave a real mark in medicine. This was the reason she had come back, the reason she had pushed aside every doubt, every fear. And yet, in rare moments of quiet, she found herself gazing out of the hospital windows, watching the city she had once called home. It wasn't just London that unsettled her. It was the knowledge that somewhere out there, he was here too. Alexander. She had avoided even saying his name in her mind for so long, but now the thought of him lingered, unshakable. That afternoon, she met Emma at a small cafe tucked away on one of the city's busy streets. The scent of fresh coffee, cinnamon, and warm bread curled through the air, wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. They settled by the window, Emma launching into a lively account of her morning. "You should have seen Brian earlier today. He was so excited about his new school. He asked if he would have science lessons and if he could do experiments in class." Lena chuckled, shaking her head. "He's obsessed. I swear if he had the chance, he'd turn our apartment into a full-fledged laboratory." Emma laughed. "Can you blame him? He clearly takes after his mother." Lena was about to reply, but then it happened. A voice she hadn't heard in 6 years. Her entire body froze. Her heart slammed into her ribs, a wild, erratic rhythm that made it hard to breathe. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that her mind was playing cruel tricks on her. But then she heard it again. "I ordered a sandwich without tomato. My daughter hates tomatoes. Can you redo that?" The air left her lungs. No, it couldn't be. But it was. Lena's hands trembled, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. A chill ran through her, coiling up her spine. Her vision blurred, the cafe's warmth fading as everything around her disappeared into a dull hum. All she could hear was that voice. All she could think of was that name. Alexander. Slowly, cautiously, she turned her head, just enough to see him, and there he was, tall, imposing. The same powerful, commanding posture that had always made people instinctively step aside when he walked past. But he was different now, older, sharper, a little colder if that was even possible. And Lena's breath caught. A daughter. The word echoed like a violent drumbeat inside her skull. Alexander Hayes had a daughter. Her pulse thundered, 1,000 questions racing through her mind, but only one took hold. When? How? Who? 6 years. 6 years without seeing him. 6 years spent trying to forget. And in mere seconds, the past had come roaring back to life. 6 years. 6 years without hearing his name. 6 years without thinking, really thinking, about the possibility of seeing him again. And yet there he was, standing just a few feet away, ordering a sandwich, complaining about tomatoes, speaking with the same confidence, the same commanding presence as if time had never passed. Lena's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She couldn't be here. She couldn't let him see her. Without a second thought, she grabbed her bag and stood up so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor. Emma frowned. "Lena, what's wrong?" "We need to leave. Now." Emma blinked in confusion. "What? But we haven't even paid." "I'll handle it later, please." There was an urgency in her voice that left no room for argument. Lena was already moving, already weaving through the crowded cafe toward the door before he could turn around. Her heart pounded so hard that she felt dizzy, the blood rushing in her ears louder than the city outside. She didn't breathe properly until she stepped onto the pavement, the cool air hitting her like a slap. Emma caught up with her a moment later, grabbing her by the arm. "Okay, what the hell just happened?" Lena ran a trembling hand through her hair. "He's here." Emma's face blanked. "Who?" Lena swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alexander." Emma's eyes widened. "Wait, Alexander Hayes? He's here?" Lena nodded, still struggling to calm her racing pulse. "And he has a daughter, Emma. I saw her name on his order." Silence fell between them. Sharp, unrelenting. Emma seemed to be processing the information, but Lena was drowning in it. Alexander had a daughter. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't. But why did it feel like something inside her had cracked open? Why did it feel like a wound she had convinced herself was healed had just been ripped apart? Emma crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Do you think he knows you're back?" Lena took a slow, unsteady breath. "I don't know, but she had to make sure he never found out." Emma sighed, shaking her head. "You know you can't avoid him forever, right?" Lena closed her eyes for a brief moment. She knew. She knew, but she had to try. The problem was, no matter how hard she ran, fate always had a way of catching up. Days passed, but the weight of that brief encounter never fully left her. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice again. Every time she let her guard down, she saw him. Tall, imposing, standing at the cafe counter, as if the past hadn't shattered them both. She told herself it was nothing. A coincidence. Their worlds were separate now. Alexander had his own family, a wife, most likely. The woman he had always loved. A daughter. A life that had nothing to do with her anymore. She repeated that thought over and over again like a mantra, like a lie she desperately wanted to believe. But deep down, she knew the truth. Some things weren't meant to stay buried. At least Brian was adjusting well. That was all that mattered. He was thriving at his new school, coming home every day bubbling with excitement, talking about his new friends, his teachers, and of course, the science experiments he wanted to try. Then, one afternoon, he came running through the front door, holding a small colored envelope in his tiny hands. "Mom," he called, practically vibrating with excitement. "I got invited to a party." Lena laughed as she took the envelope from him, scanning the name written on it. A birthday invitation. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. It's Sarah's birthday. She said there's going to be cake, a ball pit, and so many cool toys." He beamed. "Can I go, Mom? Please?" Lena's heart softened at the pure joy on his face. It was good to see him happy. Good to see him making friends so quickly. "Of course," she said, smiling. "We'll go together on Saturday." Brian cheered, jumping around the room in excitement. Lena shook her head, amused. She had no idea how much this party would change everything. Lena had never seen Brian this excited. All morning, he had been bouncing with energy, talking non-stop about the birthday party. He had checked the invitation a dozen times, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. "Mom, do you think Sarah will like my present?" he asked, holding the carefully wrapped gift against his chest. "I'm sure she'll love it." Lena reassured him, forcing a smile. She wanted this to be a good day for him. She wanted to forget the unease still lingering in her chest. As she drove through the streets, following the GPS directions, Lena started feeling off. The address didn't seem right. The area was too upscale, a private residential neighborhood filled with sprawling estates and security gates. She double-checked the invitation, hoping she had made a mistake. She hadn't. The party was here. Confused, she parked in front of a massive house with tall iron gates, the kind of home that only belonged to the ultra-rich. Her stomach twisted. Something felt wrong. She grabbed her phone, quickly dialing the contact number listed on the invitation. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Lena's world stopped. The air thickened, pressing against her lungs. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she was afraid Brian might hear it. No. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. "Hello? Who is this?" The voice, that voice, was unmistakable. Alexander. Lena's fingers clenched around the phone. Her mind screamed, "Leave, take Brian, drive away," before it was too late. But she couldn't move. Her breath caught, hands trembling, time stretching into something suffocating. One word from him, just one, and it felt like the last 6 years had never happened. For a moment, she was that same helpless woman, the one who had stood in front of him, begging for love that would never come. Then, with a sharp breath, she snapped back to reality. Without saying a word, she ended the call. Her mind whirled in chaos. Alexander was here, and not just that. He was Sarah's father. A sick, sinking feeling spread through her. She turned to Brian, who was staring at her curiously. "Mom?" he said, tilting his head. "Are we going inside?" Lena forced a smile, pushing down the panic rising in her chest. "I was just checking the address, darling." Brian, too excited to notice anything was wrong, nodded eagerly. Lena, however, couldn't stop staring at the invitation. Her hands shook as she looked again. The phone number matched. The address was correct. And suddenly, it all clicked. Alexander had a daughter. Sarah was 5 years old, the same age as Brian. Lena's blood ran cold. The math didn't add up. Her entire body went numb as realization began to creep in, slow and poisonous. No, it wasn't possible. Was it? She squeezed her eyes shut, desperate to silence the voice in her head, the one whispering things she couldn't allow herself to believe. This was a coincidence. It had to be. But doubt had already sunk its claws into her, and it wasn't letting go. She had no choice. She had to go in. Hands shaking, she climbed out of the car, helping Brian down. He held the gift tightly, bouncing on his feet, completely unaware of the storm inside his mother's heart. Lena straightened her dress, taking a slow breath. "Keep it together." She walked toward the gate, gripping Brian's hand tightly. The closer they got, the more she wanted to turn back. But she wouldn't do that to her son. Not today. A friendly woman opened the door, smiling warmly. "You must be Sarah's guests. Come in. Make yourselves at home." Lena hesitated for half a second, then stepped inside. The laughter of children filled the air. Soft music played in the background. The scent of birthday cake and frosting mingled with the light afternoon breeze. It was a picture of happiness. But Lena felt like she had stepped into a trap. She took one step forward, then another. And then she saw him, Alexander. He was on the other side of the room, tying a balloon to the table, his attention focused on his daughter. The sight of him hit her like a hurricane. His face, his posture, so painfully familiar, yet different. Older, more tired, more serious. Time had changed him, but in that moment, he was still the same man she had once loved. And just like that, the past came crashing down. Time had passed. 6 years, to be exact. But in that instant, standing there, nothing had changed. Alexander Hayes was still the same. Tall, commanding. A man whose mere presence shifted the air in any room he entered. But there was something different, too. The sharp lines of exhaustion around his eyes. The weight in his posture, hidden beneath that same calculating coldness. He hadn't seen her yet. Not until he felt her. Lena didn't move, but she knew the exact second he sensed her gaze. Because he turned. And then, their eyes met. The world stopped. Shock flashed across Alexander's face. Lena's breath hitched. Her legs faltered beneath her for just a second, but she stood her ground. Alexander, however, didn't move. His expression darkened, a silent storm brewing behind his eyes. Then slowly, he began walking toward her. Each step echoed in her chest, reverberating through every part of her. Lena felt sick. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to face him. But it was too late. Alexander's eyes were locked on hers, unrelenting, burning with questions she wasn't ready to answer. The world around them disappeared. The laughter of children, the soft background music, the chatter of parents nearby. None of it existed anymore. There was only him. And the weight of 6 years of silence between them. Lena's chest rose and fell rapidly. Her pulse pounded like she had just run a marathon. But she didn't blink. Neither did he. Alexander stopped just a few feet away, his stare sharp enough to cut. There was something undeniable in his expression. A mixture of surprise, suspicion, and something darker. Something she couldn't name. Then, just as the suffocating silence threatened to drown her, Brian tugged on her hand. "Mom," he called, oblivious to the tension thick enough to choke her. "I'm going to play with my friends." Lena blinked rapidly, snapping back into reality. "Of course, my love," she managed, her voice barely steady. Brian grinned before running off, leaving her frozen. Alexander wasn't frozen at all. He had seen everything. He had noticed. His expression shifted, his jaw tightening, his knuckles clenching at his sides. And then, finally, he spoke. His voice was low, rough, filled with something indecipherable. "You're back." Lena inhaled sharply, steadying herself. "It seems so." Silence settled between them again, but this time it was dangerous, because she could feel it, the weight of unspoken questions pressing against her. Alexander's gaze flickered, shifting slightly. And then, Lena's heart stopped cold. Because he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking past her. At the little girl running through the garden, his daughter. Lena's breath caught. She didn't want to ask. She couldn't ask. But the doubt was already there. It had already planted itself inside her, growing like a slow, suffocating poison. If Sarah and Brian were the same age, if Sarah was 5 years old, a sharp chill ran straight through Lena's spine. No, it wasn't possible. Was it? Before she could process the thought, before she could tell herself she was being ridiculous. "Mommy, Mommy!" Brian's excited voice cut through the heavy tension. Lena turned, her pulse roaring in her ears. Brian had come running back, beaming with excitement. "Sarah wants to show me her new toys." Lena stopped breathing. Sarah. Brian had said her name. So naturally, so easily, as if it meant nothing at all. But to Lena, it was the single most dangerous word he could have spoken. The moment Brian said it, Alexander stilled. Completely. As if he had been punched in the gut. Lena felt it. The way he held his breath. The way his gaze snapped to Brian. The way, for the first time, his mask cracked. She had never seen that expression on his face before. Never. Alexander looked at Brian, really looked at him. His brown curls, his deep, intelligent eyes, the structure of his face, the shape of his mouth, the resemblance was unmistakable. Lena felt the entire world spin. Alexander's chest rose and fell unevenly. For the first time in forever, he looked utterly shaken, like he had been hit by a bullet to the heart. Like he was putting the pieces together. Like he was seeing something he wasn't supposed to see. And then his eyes snapped back to her, fierce, demanding, desperate for an answer she couldn't give. His lips parted. "Lena?" His voice faltered. She said nothing. She couldn't. But the damage was already done. Alexander knew, and in that moment everything changed forever. Lena's throat tightened, choked by 6 years of unspoken words. Brian stood beside her, completely unaware of the storm raging around him. He smiled, bright-eyed, waiting for his mother's permission to run off and play with Sarah. As if the ground beneath them hadn't just split apart. He didn't understand. He couldn't. Not yet. Lena bent down beside her son, forcing a smile, ignoring the way Alexander was still staring at her, as if he could pull the truth straight out of her. "You can go, my love," she said softly, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "But if you need anything, I'll be right here." Brian nodded cheerfully, oblivious, and ran off toward the toys. As soon as he was gone, Lena stood, slowly. Her legs felt weak beneath her. Alexander stepped forward, as if instinctively trying to stop her from leaving. His gaze hadn't moved from her, but now something new burned in his expression. Something sharp, something undeniable, fury, pain, and something she had never imagined she would see on his face, vulnerability. Then, finally, his voice broke through the air, low, rough, and filled with something terrifyingly certain. "He's mine." Not a question, a realization. Lena felt her heart clench painfully. She wanted to deny it, wanted to run, wanted to flee from this moment before it was too late, because once she confirmed the truth, there would be no turning back. But she couldn't lie. Not now, not anymore. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the truth cut through her like a blade. Yes. The single word crashed between them like silent thunder. Alexander's entire body changed. His face hardened, jaw tightening as if he was trying to contain the explosion of emotions inside him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice lower now, strained with an unbearable weight. Lena swallowed dryly. "I found out when I arrived in New York." A sharp, incredulous laugh escaped him. He ran a hand through his hair, looking up at the sky, as if searching for logic in something that had none. "And you decided to hide it from me? For 6 years?" Lena felt her blood turn to ice. "I did what I thought was right." Alexander's gaze snapped back to hers, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What you thought was right." His voice was rough, dangerously low. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Lena? You tore my son out of my life before I even knew he existed." She felt her chest tighten, but she refused to let the emotions swallow her whole. "You never wanted me, Alexander," she said, her voice shaking but firm. You never loved me. You made that clear from the moment we were married. To you, I was nothing but an obligation, a burden you had to endure." His eyes burned with something volatile. "And you think that justifies what you did?" His voice dropped even lower. "You think that gave you the right to keep my son from me?" Lena took a step back, trying to steady herself. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "Brian grew up without you, and he's fine. He doesn't need a father who's only here now because of a coincidence." Alexander's entire body tensed. Coincidence? He took another step closer, eyes locking onto hers. "You think this is chance? You knew, sooner or later, I would find out." A shiver ran down her spine. "And what are you going to do about it?" she whispered. The air crackled between them. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a battle. A silent war between two people scarred by the past, standing on opposite sides of an unchangeable truth. Then, before he could answer, a child's voice cut through the moment. "Daddy." Lena froze. Alexander's expression shifted instantly. Sarah ran up to him, grabbing his hand and tugging gently on his shirt. "Aren't you going to sing Happy Birthday with me?" Lena watched, her heart twisting. Alexander's entire demeanor changed. The rage, the tension, it didn't disappear, but it softened at the edges. He bent down, brushing a hand over Sarah's hair. "Of course I will, Princess." Sarah grinned. Then, as if just noticing Lena for the first time, she turned and studied her curiously. "Are you Brian's mom?" Lena forced a smile, trying to steady her shaking hands. "Yes, I am." Sarah tilted her head slightly, her big eyes thoughtful. Then, after a second, she beamed. "Brian is really nice." Lena felt something inside her break. Alexander was still watching her. His gaze was no longer just demanding. It was calculating, processing. And Lena knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Sarah's smile was sweet and innocent, completely unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. She beamed at Lena before running off, laughing as she rejoined the other children. Alexander, however, didn't move. He simply stood there, his eyes still fixed on Lena. And in that gaze, she saw a silent promise. This wasn't over. And she knew he was right. For the first time since she had left, the past had finally caught up with the present. Lena's legs felt weak, her pulse pounding so hard she thought she might collapse. Her mind was screaming at her to run, to take Brian and get as far away from Alexander as possible. But she couldn't, because something inside her refused to move. Something that told her this moment was inevitable. Alexander's voice came again, low, firm, unshakable. "It's not over." Lena forced herself to breathe. No, it wasn't over, and it never would be. Sarah ran back to the toys, her laughter breaking through the suffocating tension, but Alexander didn't take his eyes off Lena. "I need to know everything, now." His words sent a shiver down her spine. But before she could answer, a voice interrupted them. "Mr. Hayes, may I have a word?" Alexander turned, momentarily distracted, and Lena seized the opportunity. She stepped back, her heart racing. This was too much. The pieces were falling into place too fast, and yet nothing made sense. Sarah was Brian's age. Alexander had never remarried. So who was the girl's mother? Her stomach twisted painfully. She needed to get out of here. She turned toward Brian, watching him play with Sarah, completely unaware of the storm about to descend on all of them. And then, without thinking, she turned toward the gate and walked away, her breath coming fast and uneven. She needed time to process this, to understand what was happening. But before she could cross the threshold, Alexander's voice rang out again. Firm. Definitive. Lena. She stopped cold. She didn't turn around, didn't move. Then his next words shattered her world. "You need to know who Sarah is." Her fingernails dug into her palms. She didn't want to hear it. She couldn't listen. But at the same time, every fiber of her being demanded the answer. Slowly, she turned to face him. Alexander stepped forward, his eyes dark and unrelenting. "I adopted her." Lena's breath caught. Her mind went blank. "What?" Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to find the right way to say it. 6 years ago, my daughter was born lifeless." Lena's entire world tilted. Her chest tightened painfully. Alexander's voice was quieter now, but the weight of his words pressed down on her like a crushing force. She was rushed to the NICU. The doctors tried to revive her. It was a miracle. Against all odds, she survived. Lena couldn't breathe. Her knees threatened to buckle. But Alexander wasn't finished. "The mother?" He paused, his expression darkening. She wasn't there anymore. Lena's stomach dropped. Alexander clenched his jaw, struggling with something buried deep. She had already been discharged. The baby was presumed dead. It was a mistake, a terrible one by the hospital. Lena's vision blurred. A cold, sharp fear curled in her gut. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Alexander took a deep breath, his face unreadable. "The mother gave birth in London. Then she disappeared." Lena felt like she had been punched in the chest. They said she was just passing through, that she was returning to New York after the birth. The hospital tried to contact her, but his voice tightened. They couldn't reach her. There weren't enough records. The world swirled. The air became suffocating. Lena staggered back, her fingers gripping the metal gate to keep herself upright. "No, no." Alexander's voice was distant now, muffled beneath the ringing in her ears. She was in intensive care for weeks, fighting to survive, but when she was finally discharged, he swallowed hard. She had no one. Silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the entire world had stopped turning. Lena's chest heaved. "That's when I met her," Alexander continued, his voice softer now. "I had just started working at the hospital. My grandfather was still alive back then. But Lena wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was stuck, spinning, shaking. The hospital, the NICU, the doctors, the baby girl she had lost. Her legs gave out, her body crashed against the cold metal gate. Because in that moment, she knew the truth, and it destroyed her." Alexander's voice was quieter now, but there was something raw beneath it, something Lena had never heard before. "I couldn't leave her behind." Lena's hands trembled, her heart pounded so hard she could feel it echoing in her ears. Alexander Hayes, the cold, calculating man who once treated her as nothing more than a burden, had adopted an abandoned little girl? It didn't make sense, and yet it made perfect sense. Her breath hitched as a terrifying thought took hold of her mind. It slammed into her like a wave, leaving her breathless. I need to see her birth certificate." Alexander frowned, his suspicion intensifying. "Why?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat tight and dry. She couldn't tell him, not yet, not until she was sure. "Please, Alexander." For a long moment he just stared at her as if trying to read her soul. Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone and sent a message. Minutes later, his assistant appeared with an envelope. Alexander took it, his gaze never leaving Lena as he held it out to her. She reached for it with shaking hands. The envelope felt heavy, too heavy. Lena's eyes scanned the document, her breath catching as she read. Until she saw it. A single date, Sarah's birth date. 3 days after Brian's. Lena staggered. The paper slipped from her grasp, but Alexander caught it effortlessly, his sharp eyes never missing a detail. "Lena?" His voice was low, edged with something dangerous. She couldn't answer, she couldn't breathe. She felt her knees weaken as the realization hit her with full force. Sarah wasn't just any little girl, she was Brian's twin. She was her daughter. She was his daughter. The baby girl she thought had died in the hospital had never actually died. Lena's entire world shattered. Alexander stepped closer, his expression now rigid with alarm. "What is it?" Lena's lips parted, but no words came out. Because how? How could she possibly say it? Her eyes flickered toward Sarah, her little girl, laughing with Brian, completely unaware of the storm about to destroy everything. They didn't know. Neither of them knew. And now, she had to deal with a truth that would change everything. Alexander's voice cut through the silence, low and sharp. "Lena, tell me what's going on." She tried to form the words, but they wouldn't come. And then she saw it. The exact moment Alexander put the pieces together. His entire body stiffened, his confusion disappeared, and in its place, something far more dangerous took hold. Anger, shock, betrayal. His gaze darkened, his breathing uneven. "Lena," his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a hurricane. "What have you done?" Lena felt her chest tighten, her pulse racing wildly. She choked on the words. Alexander's jaw locked, his hands clenching into fists. "She's mine, isn't she?" His voice was raw, desperate, broken. Lena's throat burned. She nodded, and just like that, the world collapsed around them. Alexander took a step back as if the truth had physically struck him. His face was ashen, his hands gripping the edges of the table beside him as if trying to steady himself. 6 years. 6 years without knowing. 6 years without his daughter, without both of them. His voice was barely a whisper, filled with rage and agony. You kept her from me. Lena's breath caught, but before she could speak, Sarah ran up to them, giggling, her little arms wrapping around Alexander's leg. Daddy, come cut the cake. Alexander's... He looked down at Sarah, his daughter, and then back at Lena, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions. This isn't over. His voice was a quiet promise, a warning, and Lena knew he meant every word, because now nothing would ever be the same again. The sky over London was painted in soft hues of gold and lavender as Lena stood by the window, staring at the city below. It had been 3 weeks since that fateful day, the day everything changed. Alexander hadn't let her disappear this time. He demanded answers. He demanded time with his children. And Lena, she had no choice but to let him in. Now, as she watched Brian and Sarah playing together in the garden, their laughter filling the crisp evening air, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. She had spent so long running from the past, believing she had to fight alone. But maybe she didn't have to anymore. Behind her, Alexander's voice was low but certain. We have a lot to figure out, Lena. She turned to him, meeting his gaze, the same intense, unreadable gaze that once terrified her. But this time there was something different. Not just anger, not just betrayal, but something else, something real. Lena took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, we do. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just the end of their past. Maybe it was the beginning of something new.